Rina Kausji, taking you through Energy Finance 2024. That's also your hashtag for social media postings, and at IEEFA_Asia Pacific on LinkedIn as well as X. Welcoming you all back. We hope you had a good lunch and a great opportunity to network. And also hello again to all the participants joining us online via the Hoover app. We hope you also have that downloaded so you can ask questions for all the sessions. And our next session, without further ado, is entitled The Role of Sustainable Finance for Energy Transition in Emerging Asian Markets. Introducing us first of all to Shantanu Srivastava, IEEFA's research lead for sustainable finance and climate risk, who will be moderating the discussion. He's also joined on stage with our panelists, Minesh Pimple, Deputy Municipal Commissioner of the Environment and Climate Change Department in Mumbai, Dennis Wan, Head of Capital Markets APAC at CDP, Chi Xiang Wong, Senior Analyst at Climate Bonds Initiative, and rounded off with Diana Tang, Director of Sustainable Finance at ING. All that said and done, Shantanu, time is yours. Over to you.
Hello. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to all who's gathered the courage to attend a post-lunch session on financing. And a very warm welcome to also everyone who's joining us online for this particular session. This is the penultimate session of this conference, and today we're going to talk about the role that sustainable finance markets can play in the energy transition in emerging Asian economies. And to do that, we have a distinguished list of panelists today who will be sharing their thoughts, experiences, and expertise on the topic. So on my left, we have Mr. Minesh Pimple from the Mumbai Municipality Authority. Besides him, we have Mr. Dennis Wan, who is from CDP. Next to him, we have Mr. Chi Xiang Wong from the Climate Bonds Initiative. And lastly, we have Ms. Diana Tang, who is from ING. So in terms of the session format, we have a 75-minute discussion. And I'll take a couple of minutes to first set the context in terms of the discussion, why we want to have the discussion in the first place. And then we'll have 5 minutes of opening remarks from all the 4 panelists. Post that, we'll have close to 40 minutes of moderated discussion. We'll have 2 rounds of Q&A with the panelists, and which is going to leave us with around 10 to 15 minutes of questions from the audience. And I think all of you must be aware by now that we're taking questions only through the WOA app. So make sure to put in your questions through that app, and we'll take them towards the fag end of the session. All right. So if you can have the presentation, please. All right. So I'll just take a couple of minutes to just take you through why it's important to have this discussion in the first place. And so when you talk about sustainable finance, this is essentially the market for any instruments where an investor would take into consideration the environmental, social, and governance aspects of an investment into their decision-making process. And while there is an equity market for this, as in the general financial markets, the debt markets are massive, right? And some of the key instruments that we have seen issued in the sustainable finance markets include green bonds and loan, social bonds and loans, sustainability bonds and loans, transition bonds and loans, and so on. Now, the market for these instruments today stands somewhere around $8.5 trillion of combined assets under management. And if you see a 5 to 6 year trajectory of growth of these instruments, it's an accelerating trajectory. And some of the reasons why the markets are growing, specifically the sustainable finance markets, is because increasingly globally investors are aligning their investment principles with ESG investing style. We're seeing a lot of regulations that are coming up that are growing the market, pushing the markets forward. We're also seeing that there is a lot of innovation that is happening in the market. So new instruments are entering, which are expanding the scope of the market to different sectors and economies. And today there is a much better understanding among investors globally in terms of what is the climate risk on their books and what are the opportunities that low carbon transition brings. And along with that, there is also familiarity today in the entire ecosystem, so within regulators, investors, and issuers in terms of what is the scope and the mechanics of access in this market. And all of this is then pushing the markets forward. But if you see the issuances, they're still very much concentrated in the developed markets. So emerging market developing economies, while they have 50% of global GDP, the contribution to global GDP is 50%, the sustainable finance that they've raised only comprises close to 14 to 15%. And majority of that, more than 50% of that is essentially being raised by national governments. So there is very little private sector involvement in raising these instruments. Sorry, can you go to the next slide, please? All right. Another key trend that we're witnessing is that globally, some of the largest banks are also ratcheting up their efforts to finance low carbon transition. So today, some of the largest banks combined have ambitions to finance up to $18 trillion worth of investments in the low carbon space over the next 6 to 7 years. And obviously, this does not mean that all of this capital will definitely be mobilized for investments, but what it shows is that there is definitely an intent and a direction which banks today are thinking when it comes to low carbon sectors and assets. However, if you look what's the scenario with banks in the emerging Asian markets, you won't see a lot of domestic banks having the same kind of commitments or the same kind of direction which they're thinking. And this becomes important in the context that majority of the infrastructure assets, even low carbon assets, are still going to be financed through bank-led channels in the foreseeable future. Another key trend, I think we missed one slide. Thanks. From the demand side of things, what we're seeing is that green finance instruments such as green bonds are now becoming a very important mix of the overall capital structure of a lot of companies globally. So several clean energy companies, what they do is they go out in the market, they refinance their existing projects, which frees up capital from their balance sheets and their existing bank financing lines to then invest into pipeline projects. But again, if you look at this from the context of the emerging Asian markets, a lot of this is still very much limited to top-tier firms and sovereigns. So this action is not really translated into small and medium-sized public and private corporates and sub-sovereign entities such as ULBs. And lastly, what we're also seeing, and we had one entire discussion dedicated on ESG regulatory space in the region. Today, more than 35 jurisdictions globally have close to 400 plus sustainability-related regulations, disclosures, taxonomies, transition plan requirements, which covers close to 90% of global GDP. So there's a lot of regulatory action also happening on this front to grow these markets. And like you saw in the previous slides, there is investor interest, there is an interest from the developers themselves, the issuers themselves, and understanding also, all of them to grow these markets. But the question that we really need to answer is that, do we need to even focus on a sub-segment of the market, which is just 7% of the total debt markets? Do we need, as emerging market players, spend our energies and efforts and finances to really tap into this particular section of the market? And the answer is an overwhelming yes. And there are a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, when you talk about this 7%, this is actually up from 4% just 3 years back. And if you see this trajectory, I think there was a graph showing that the trajectory of this market is actually increasing. So if you really want to ensure that in the future, in the next 5 to 10 years, entities based out of emerging markets are able to finance their transitions through the sustainable finance markets, you need to create that ecosystem today. And that is where capacity building becomes extremely important. Second thing is, there's a lot of debate around having greenium, or rather the lack of it, and why it then makes sense to go for an issuance of a green bond and any sustainable finance instruments. And I think a better way to look at it is rather the availability of capital. So you have a capital pool which has aligned itself with financing low carbon transition, which otherwise would not have been available in developing markets. So rather than looking at any pricing benefits, I think an important metric to look at is the availability of capital in the first place. And lastly, and I'll end my opening remarks with this, emerging market developing economies have close to 20% of the total financial wealth, and more than 50% of new infrastructure development in the next couple of decades is going to happen in these regions. And now, majority of the sustainable finance that we're talking about, this is not, more than 90% is not being issued in these markets, it's in the developed markets. And there's always this debate in platforms like COP and G20 that, need to have more flows of, more climate flows from developed world to developing world. And now you have a market which actually has that source of capital. So why not tap into it? Finance your transition through these markets. And that's where I'll end my quote. And as next steps, I'll invite Mr. Pimple to provide his opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Shantanu, for this introduction and for monitoring this important session. Like the main subject is a finance, and I am not at all a finance guy. I'm the one who spends the money as a corporation. ULB's job is to spend the money based on the policies that our policymaker makes and to execute the job successfully and to give the end results to the citizens and ensure that we'll make the city enjoyable and livable. That is the first job of us. Regarding the financials, as regards to Mumbai, we use our own resources as far as the finance is concerned. Mumbai is a cash-rich corporation, so whatever we collect from the taxes, we spend that money. Moreover, nowadays, Government of India has launched few years back Swachh Bharat Mission, that is Clean India program, under which there is a lot of funds that has been provided. And now, recently, 3 years back, we have started providing the money under the Water Fund and Air Fund. Now, with the solid waste management sectors, there are people who are ready to invest without any gate fee also, because the tariff structures and everything. So, as for the investors, what important for me is to return of investment. It is there in India and Mumbai especially. So, challenges in scaling up the sustainable finance, because we get a finance, but then in order to operate certain projects, which is 20 years, 25 years, sustainable finance is required. So despite this, the global bond market's uncertainty and high interest rates have made it difficult for many emerging market players to raise the sustainable debt. And that is one charge. And opportunities for the growth and collaboration, I'll say into that, to overcome these challenges, which I said earlier, it is crucial to scale up sustainable finance through innovative financial instruments and public-private partnerships. In India, and specifically in Mumbai, we have got many projects under PPP schemes, and they're successfully running. So conclusion, I'll come to conclusion. The collaboration between government, financial institutions, and corporate is a key to advancing sustainable finance and energy transition in Mumbai. For that matter, it's there in Asia too. So I look forward to a discussion today on how we can achieve these goals together. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pimple. Dennis, if you could go next.
Oh, gee, I didn't realize we had to stand up for this thing. I'm going to take my opening remarks to avoid the assumption that you know who CDP is, and describe and introduce who CDP is, and then describe where we fit in the framework of sustainable finance. So CDP is an idea that 3 young people had 24 years ago. They were sitting in a London cafe and they thought to themselves, how do we save the world? And 24 years ago, this wasn't the most important question to a lot of the world. They realized that it wasn't really going to be down to individuals and individual choices, whether we used a plastic cup or whether we used a ceramic one. Accept that, you're not going to destroy the world that much. Ignore that, and you're not going to save the world that much more. Because they realized that the impact on the world was being made by big companies, Big companies, by the way they waste, the way they produce, the way they sell things to us that we don't really need, 150 years of unbridled capitalism had left us scientifically in a hole 24 years ago, which has only gotten deeper since then. They thought to themselves, let's ask big companies to measure their impact on nature. With data, you get knowledge, you will want to do better, correct your ways. The problem is that if we three young people ask big companies to provide data, they're going to ignore us. Who are you? So they had a second idea, and the second idea was to go talk to banks and financial institutions, the providers of finance, because they own the big companies. They finance the big companies in the way that they operate. And that kind of worked. A band of 35 financial institutions asked about 200 big corporations, why don't you measure your environmental impact? Provide the data, CDP will collect it, provide it back to finance. So this was the founding of sustainable finance, we feel. Data that had never been seen before, P&L decisions previously had never taken account of this kind of thing, and the ball is rolling. 24 years later, we, CDP, have 700 members who are called signatories, calling the entire world to disclose financial, environmental information, treating it almost as though it was a financial risk. 2/3 of the listed market capitalization of the world discloses this environmental data to CDP along themes of carbon, climate change, water, security, forestry, plastics, biodiversity, the entirety of nature. This is the largest standardized environmental database in the world. It feeds back to finance to now can carry on with the sustainable finance industry that has been building, but it is also fed back to the companies themselves, who themselves have also started asking their supply chains, this massive Scope 3 footprint that they have, to impact the way that they behave as well. This data is fed back to governments to make policies and rules to try and guide the economy to a more nature-positive sense, and it's provided to academia to do research. That's where CDP sits. It sources all of this environmental data, feeds all of the green indices that you see in the world. And out of that, the sustainable finance industry is now finding different ways to use it. CDP data can power sustainable supply chain finance, which actually helps the companies help their supply chains using CDP data as KPIs. We use CDP data, we provide CDP data to financial firms who create indices, and other firms then are able to create structured products of those indices. Other funds will use CDP data as selection criteria to try and allocate assets to more nature positivity. And KPIs are driven by CDP to create sustainability-linked loans and sustainability-linked products, again, to try and help the capital to get to the right place to actually change and save the planet. There's a long way to go. Of the 700 financial institutions with 146 trillion assets who are asking the world for data, only 6 trillion of that is actually from Asia. And when we think about Southeast Asia, that's going to be even less. But our continuing mission as a not-for-profit, which is what we still remain here, is to get that data, and through the data and the disclosure that we will talk about a little later as well, engender insight so that action can be taken to achieve the aim that we're all hoping for here, save the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dinesh. And I think you've really underscored the very important role entities such as CDP has played in creating the overall ecosystem of sustainable finance and disclosures. CX, if you can go next, and I think we can have the opening remarks sitting over here itself.
Sure, thanks, Shantan. So yeah, I'll remain over here. And I think in terms of climate bonds initiative, CBI, for those who have heard, in terms of setup, it's pretty similar like what Dennis has described as a non-profit organization, same like the CDP. So Climate Bonds Initiative was launched back in 2009 with the goal of mobilizing capital market, specifically the debt capital market, hence climate bonds. But throughout the years, CBI or climate bonds have expanded its ambit, working in various facets of green financial ecosystem, including loans and the broader debt market. Started off as a standard setter, which till now has been pivotal in sort of spurring and developing the sustainable finance market. You may have heard of Climate Bond Standard, first green bond standards launched by Climate Bonds Initiative. Again, with the initial intention of mobilizing capital from the capital market, and since then, the banking sector, the insurance sector have also sort of leveraged on the standards to define some of the science-based sector criteria, which hence led to the development of climate bonds taxonomy, that climate bonds has been working with regulators, policymakers globally, feeding input into the development of national and regional taxonomies. So some of the taxonomies that climate bonds has developed and sort of supporting various regulators, including Singapore, Thailand, and so on and so forth, Cambodia. So CBI do work and support emerging Asian markets in terms of developing the credible science-based sector criteria that will aid the classification of green economic activities for the financial markets. Another aspect probably to highlight is that Climate Bonds has been working with regulators, like I mentioned, capital market regulators, banking regulators, finance ministries, debt management offices, in terms of developing the local green bond or green capital, sustainable capital market. Started off with supporting ASEAN Capital Markets Forum, which is a grouping of 10 ASEAN capital market regulators in developing various sustainable bonds or financing standards, and moving on to not just mobilizing private capital, but also recognizing the importance of sovereign issuers or investors, state-owned investment funds, which are important or crucial in spurring the sustainable finance or debt market, which Climate Bonds has also been providing technical guidance to various sovereign entities and state-owned enterprises globally, especially in emerging Asia, in formulating or developing credible sovereign green bond frameworks, which set as sort of the best practice or as a guidance for local corporates who will then leverage that as a case study or example for further issuances. So I think I'll stop there, but happy to deliberate further later on in terms of role of sovereign issuers and investors as well as corporate issuances. Thank you.
Thank you, CX. And we'll delve deeper into some of the things that CBI has actually done in the region. Over to you, Diana.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation as well. I think maybe I'll give a bit of an introduction of ING. So ING is headquartered in the Netherlands. Originally, we're headquartered in Singapore. So as a wholesale bank, we have a presence in 11 markets in Asia. So besides the offices in Singapore, we have a presence in Australia, Korea, Japan, in China, we have offices in Beijing, Shanghai, obviously in Hong Kong, and in the Philippines. So we've rep offices in some other sites, including Vietnam, Indonesia, and India. So from a sustainability or a sustainable finance perspective, I think sustainability is at the heart of what we do. So we view this as an integral part of business. It is not I like to say that sustainable finance is not really a standalone product. Because from a product perspective, a loan is a loan. A credit facility is a credit facility, but how do you sort of overlay and integrate sustainability considerations into financings? So as a bank, we do have, I think, Shantanu, you spoke about sustainable finance sort of targets. As a bank, we do have a commitment. We term it as a commitment to mobilize up to euros 150 billion per annum by 2027 to have these funds facilitate our clients' transition. So from a sort of focus perspective, how do we actually manage that? We have different teams. Obviously, the coverage teams will be talking to the clients, but I'm from the sustainable finance team, where one of our core strategies is really to engage customers on their sustainability ambitions. And how do we implement that? And that is actually through our climate strategy approach. So we call this the Terra approach, where we have a very sector-focused approach, which is science-based. It's a science-based toolbox that covers the most carbon-intensive parts of our portfolio. So these are not the easy sectors. We're not talking about just renewables. We're talking about steel, we're talking about shipping, aviation, real estate, commercial, residential, etc. So we actually take a science-based approach, and it is not perfect. But if you go into the climate report, happy to share the link, if anyone has an interest, we actually have a fairly detailed disclosure. We share quite a lot in terms of how we approach each of these sectors. We cannot cover every single part of the value chains of each of the sectors, but we are focusing on the most carbon-intensive parts of each of the sectors. And every year you can then see the evolution, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, 1 year ago. How does that actually move? We expand our scope year on year. We update it based on the latest developments in science. One thing I would also caveat is that we don't just look at the E part. We don't just look at carbon emissions. Yes, that is very, very important. But we also have very sort of strong policies on nature, biodiversity, and social. So I'm happy to share a little bit of our thoughts in terms of how we navigate and how we engage on these points, but it's also important to look beyond just one single topic within sustainability. So I'll take a pause here and we can start with the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Diana. And I'll just jump into the Q&A discussion then. And let me start with UCX. I think one of the key issues with the limited sustainable finance issuances in emerging markets, especially in the region, has been the insufficient capacity of domestic entities to access global sustainable markets, and along with that, a shortage of domestic ESG-aligned investors, right? So it's sort of a double whammy. And this is a problem that is known, right? And today, close to 30 plus different capacity building programs are being run across the world to bridge that gap, right? But if you can just point out some key bottlenecks when you talk about capacity development needs that are prevalent in this region, and that should be the focus of regulators and policymakers, what should they be?
Thanks, Shantanu. So in terms of capacity building and technical assistance, which is mainly my scope of the work that I'm supporting for client bonds in this side of the world. So what client bonds have been doing is that we use or sort of leverage on capacity building initiatives, which will then lead to various policy advisory or engagements with sovereign policymakers and regulators. So we have been, in terms of energy transition, running a few programs in Southeast Asia or East Asia as a whole. Leveraging on our expertise, we do have a team in Greater China, a local team in Japan, as well as a few supporting in Southeast Asia. So we sort of start off in terms of, again, building the awareness and developing capacity of regulators, capital market regulators, central banks, finance ministries, and even, as you mentioned, probably in terms of the industry, so industry or energy ministries, on the awareness or sort of the importance of financing clean energy or clean sustainability initiatives within their country, aligned with their national green strategy. So that's an area that CBI has been working consistently on. So apart from probably bottlenecks that I've mentioned, the capacity part, so CBI has also been supporting various stakeholders in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, in building up their standards. Hence, earlier on, I talked upon the taxonomy or sector criteria that CBI has been supporting directly on a couple of ASEAN member states. So working closely with the regulators in developing a taxonomy aligned with the global best practices, science-based, credible, but also tailored to the local nuances of respective financial markets. So those are the two aspects that I would say that has been sort of identified as the key areas of emerging markets, bottlenecks, and CBI have been working with respective stakeholders in addressing it.
Thank you so much, CX. And I think on the topic of capacity development, one of the entities which actually need a lot of capacity development are subnational entities such as ULBs, urban local bodies. And what we've seen is that, and what's also known is that subnational initiatives on climate resilience, adaptation, and energy use are crucial for achieving national climate goals in this part of the world, right? However, if you see majority of subnational, so there's a survey which says that 2/3 of subnational entities globally have cited the lack of financing opportunities or access to finance as the key bottleneck for them to achieve their climate goals. And if you, there's another study which also points out the fact that in emerging markets, less than 4% of total public debt is from the, public markets, at the capital markets and from the bank financing lines. However, one, I would say a ULB which has stood out from all the others has in Mumbai in its exemplary climate action. So Mr. Pimple, can you share some of the things that really worked from Mumbai, which really helped it put in the path towards sustainability, achieving its net zero goals? And you could also point out, I know you mentioned that, Mumbai is a cash-rich ULB, and, you're primarily focusing on financing climate initiatives through your own coffers. But I think there were some plans earlier to also raise sustainable debt. So if you could also touch upon that.
Yeah, thank you, Shantanu. After India signed the Paris Agreement, thereafter Mumbai has taken initiative and we have launched our climate action plan. Before that, we had done the vulnerability assessment study and GHG gas emission, greenhouse gas emission. And based on that, we identified the sectors where we should work on. So in our Mumbai climate action plan, we have identified 6 sectors like building energy, sustainable transport, sustainable waste management, sustainable water management, and so on, which has been again subdivided in order to execute them, again subdivided into 24 action tracks or 24 specific actions which are aligned with the climate change. And based on that, we have started working on that. We have all the whatever work that has to be taken was grilled through that green lens. So in order to, as a governing tool, we are also prepared the green budget this year. That has been published on this 5th of June this year. And Mumbai was the 4th city after Oslo, London, and New York to declare their green budget. And as a commitment towards the climate change and provide good environment to the people, we have 33% of our capital budget is for these green works. So that is a massive investment Mumbai is doing so as to make our city enjoyable and livable. And like a few examples like STPs, sewage treatment plants, coastal roads, in order to have free traffic. There in BST, there is one transport wing of a corporation which operates the buses. More than 3,500 buses are plying on the roads of Mumbai, out of which 2,900 buses are converting into EV. We have already issued the contracts. We have started receiving, but in earlier sessions, we have seen that supply demand, there is a big gap. So even we are facing that issue, but at the same time, we are confident that within this next year, 3,000 buses of electric vehicle will be plying on the road. So from the air point of view, from water point of view, from transport point of view, we had started taking action and started investing accordingly. And as I said, with the help of green budget, will be going for MER activities so that it's not that just we declare a budget and will not follow it up. So all these actions has been initiated by the BMC. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mimple. And I think
One more.
sorry, yeah, please go on.
One major aspect to save the nature, we have got the construction and demolition rules. And everywhere, in the most of the developed countries, the recycling is important. So it was not there earlier in the rules, which was specific. Now, in 2025-26, all these developers has to go for at least utilize 50% of recycled material. And 26-27, it will be 100%. And if they don't utilize that, there is a penal action too. And that is a very big steps towards saving our nature.
Thank you. I think really important points that you've raised over here. And like you mentioned, these are the building blocks, right? The policies and rules and a green budgeting exercise, which eventually will help in any ULB to understand what it's spending and what it really needs to spend when it comes to climate. I think you also mentioned a bit about financing plans. And the financing for in ULB would come from bank financing channels and also from the capital markets. And banks in this region, like I mentioned in the opening remarks, are going to be playing a very, very important role in providing capital for any sort of energy transition investment. So Diana, you've been heading several initiatives in the region. You are part of a bank which is probably one of the most ambitious sustainable finance commitments. And I think one of the trends that we've seen is that when there is sort of a global bank which has a branch based out of an emerging markets, there's a lot of push towards upskilling, reskilling of bank employees to start considering, ESG factors into lending decision-making process, and also push, diversify their lending books towards low carbon sectors. But as we stand today, majority of the finance from all of these banks that we saw for low carbon investments have actually gone in developed markets. Right? Even though there are several of these institutions operating in this region. So why do you think there is this dichotomy there? Why do you think there has been low mobilization of bank lending to low carbon investments in the region by the likes of ING? And what do you think should be the policy direction, if any, to overcome this?
Yeah, maybe a couple of comments on that point. There's always a lot of conversations about the financing gap, the fact that trillions of dollars need to go into the energy transition. So I think before we go into all of that, I think the reality is every time we look at the data from BNEF, etc., you notice that, look, the numbers are actually not as high as where it needs to be. But taking a step back, it also means that for banks to be doing sustainable finance transactions, the banks themselves would need to be aware to say, look, how do you define sustainable finance? Is there a certain level of consistency? And that's where I think there's quite a lot of alignment, increasing levels of alignment, I would say, in terms of taxonomy developments. So using, let's say, renewable energy as an example, even when you have a conversation with a company or even with banks, they might go, look, renewable energy project should be sustainable finance. No, the answer is not necessarily. So if you're looking at a hydro plant, for example, it's not just a tick the box exercise or the use of proceeds goes towards the construction and the development of a hydro plant. So when you actually have taxonomies in place, you have a clearer reference points to say what else needs to be considered. You do need to consider the other potential impact in terms of impact on communities, impact on social agendas, impact on biodiversity, etc. So you have that do no significant harm sort of component, and it provides a clearer direction, I think, for financial institutions that you are not just doing lending based on what you think is relevant as green, because end of the day, the banks do take fundings from elsewhere, and this form of funding could be from the capital markets, it could be from investors, etc. So there is that fiduciary duty as well to ensure that you're well positioned, you're able to articulate and be transparent about the way that you use your proceeds. So with more and more banks, I think in Asia, who are establishing their sustainable finance frameworks, whilst making reference to the developments of the taxonomies, I think the growth is going to be there. We do see more commitments from the broader sector. That's probably one of the key things. In terms of capacity development, I think there's quite a lot of ecosystem development that's been happening. There's a lot of training, let's say, for relationship managers of coverage teams, for example, to have transition discussions. And that's where maybe I'll make a bit of a reference to the work that CDP has done. So we do refer to publicly available data from CDP to help us actually measure and assess clients' of transition plans. So I think when more and more companies get onto such sort of disclosure platforms, increasingly, banks will have access to more standardized sets of data and measurement to actually help us have those discussions.
Thanks, Diana. And very important to have that definitional gap bridge through taxonomies, right? Where the ecosystem, there is a common language in which you speak what is green, what is non-green, right? So, yeah, for a bank also, it's easy to understand if you're financing something, can it actually be considered as sustainable finance end of the day or not? And one of the things that you pointed out was the importance of data, right? Or essentially disclosures from whichever entity that you're lending to. And what we've seen in the region is that, Dennis, very broadly, the quality and depth of disclosures of large corporates in the region have actually improved substantially over the last couple of years. And it's either through regulatory action that is happening or through some sort of investor pressure. But that's an improving trajectory that they're on. But we've not really seen the similar action from the MSME sector, the medium, small, micro enterprises in the region. And while a lot of these sustainability disclosure requirements, they're not directly for these MSMEs, but there is always a spillover effect. So when you talk about, let's say, scope 3 emission, a lot of the MSMEs come into the supply chain of the larger corporates, and in turn, they also have to ensure that they're sort of disclosing as per the sustainability regulation of certain jurisdiction. Similarly, due to the complexity of global supply chains, if you, let's say, have an ESRS in the EU and some MSME based out of India is supplying to a company in the EU, they also get in the net of an ESRS in terms of disclosures. And we know the MSMEs in the region are in no way capable right now to actually provide those kind of disclosures. So my question to you is, what is the way forward for this? Are there any examples that we can bank on? Is there anything that has happened in the region that could be replicated by other regions? And what's been your experience guiding MSMEs in the region?
Thank you for the question. So the question's about MSMEs, micro, small, medium enterprises. And just for amusement's sake, I've been in this field of sustainability for a couple of years, but prior to that, I worked in banking for 23 years. And SME in banking meant subject matter expert. That's all it meant. And so when everybody starts talking about SMEs and SMEs, I was terribly confused for quite a while until I caught up with what we're talking about. But why are they important and why are they relevant to sustainable finance? Let me digress for a moment. There are in my role as head of capital markets means I'm dealing with banks and financial institutions. There's maybe 30 globally systemically important banks in the world. In each country, there's maybe 5 domestically systemically important banks. If you do the math on how many countries there are, 193 odd, times these kind of numbers, add in the big, huge global banks, you're still going to end up with hundreds, maybe thousands of banks. But as for the big corporations that I was talking about, there's tens of thousands of those. I know that because I claimed in my introduction that CDP collects data from 2/3 of the listed market capitalization of the world, and that was from 23,000 companies. So even accounting for all of the big corporations who you say are progressing in data disclosure who are dodging us, we're still talking about tens of thousands. But how many MSMEs are there in the world? We're talking millions, and these are, as you say, in the supply chains of the larger companies. In Malaysia, in 2018, they measured that they had 900,000 MSMEs. So I'm pretty sure that however long, 6-7 years on now, that we're over 1 million. This is very important, and it's still related to sustainable finance, because if you take the number of financing institutions, the hundreds or thousands, and then you look at the tens of thousands of big corporate clients that they could have, then there's only so much fight that ING can have over those limited number of clients. Most of your clients for sustainable finance are going to be MSMEs, are going to be smaller companies who are lost in the world of disclosure. I know that they're lost in the world of disclosure because when I first joined CDP, then I was terribly enthusiastic. I believed that this was the gospel. Disclosure was going to save the world. Disclosure, insight, action. And I would evangelize to any CFO that I could get on a video conference. I would look them in the eye. I would tell them I had the good news and that all your company needed to do was to disclose, get an idea of itself, and then it could help in all of these ways and get access to capital, business utility, comply, ABC, all of these great things were going to come out of disclosure. And then the CFO would rub their eyes at me and say, Dennis, that sounds great, but I'm an SME. I don't understand everything that's going on here. So you wanted examples of what is being done to help MSMEs. CDP, for a start, actually this year in 2024 introduced an SME questionnaire. Instead of the giant questionnaire filled with thousands of data points covering biodiversity and nature and all aspects, which we even hit with cities. We hit cities with this kind of questioning as well. And these are the things that are useful as this giant data set. An SME questionnaire is a far smaller list of questions with simpler language, without terrible jargon, getting to the essential points. Why don't you tackle these things? And not necessarily explaining why you have to tackle these things, just getting you started. Getting you started, measuring yourself and going on that journey. Because the way to get better disclosure is to just get started. The way for all of you who interact with SMEs to say, it can get better. There will be ABCs for you. There will be access to capital. There will be business utility. You can learn to comply, would be to get started on a simpler questionnaire. That's our answer. But even so, local regulators are even more worried about their local SMEs. I'll move on to Malaysia in a moment. But back in Hong Kong, for instance, a cross-agency steering group was set up, the CASG, just because we didn't have enough acronyms. And this was made up of the SFC and the Hong Kong Monetary Authority and the insurance regulator and others. And they also got together to put together a questionnaire for the local Hong Kong micro community, micro and small and medium enterprises, of which Hong Kong reflects a place like Southeast Asia as well. Most companies are small companies. They licensed CDP questions because they didn't quite know where to start, and they rolled that out a year ago in order to try and service the local community. Here in Malaysia, you are blessed with a plethora of approaches now. Bank Negara Malaysia has introduced a taxonomy to try and make things simple. They're operating off 5 guiding principles. It's a principles-based taxonomy, so it's called the Climate Change Principle-Based Taxonomy, the CCPT. And the first and second guiding principles are more more project-based. But the third and fourth ones are about transitioning and, what was the other one? Do no significant harm. Because it was principle-based, this taxonomy was thrown out there to try and make things simple. They also found the SMEs didn't really know what to do with it. So they fell back on the tested method of, I'll give you some questions. They commissioned some questions, which they called the due diligence questionnaire, and said, answer these questions. It will guide you along to how to comply with this taxonomy. And then they told all of the banks in Malaysia, this is the kind of information that you want to gather if you want to provide access to finance for local Malaysian SMEs. Then Capital Markets Malaysia also came along and wanted to be helpful, and they set something up called the Simplified ESG Disclosure Guide, the SEDG. 15 data points, and those 15 data points were also split against basic SMEs, intermediate SMEs, and advanced SMEs. Only the advanced SMEs had to gather all of these 15 elements. And again, they're throwing it out there, trying to make things helpful for folks. Realistically, SMEs are, when blessed with this much competing help, are going to do what they need to do based upon the pressure that they receive or their particular needs. If they are trying to work with Malaysian banks, they're going to have to get to grips with the CCPT. If they want to comply with what could be coming regulation here, a compliance aspect, then they're going to have to learn and do what the SEDG asks. If they are part of a more international supply chain and find that the international buyer uses CDP, then they're likely to have to come to rise to the challenge of a CDP SME questionnaire. But there's many parties trying to help there. Sometimes it doesn't feel like that. If you're an SME, you just feel like I'm drowning in a sea of complexity here. But there are, almost all of them share this characteristic. We're trying to make it simpler for you. We're not going to try and explain why, but trust us, it will help you if you can start measuring your impact and then doing better.
Thanks, Dinesh. And I think when you talk about MSMEs, compliance is a very slippery slope, right? I mean, you don't really want to be burdening MSMEs with over compliance, right? So that's a good approach where you first try to develop their capacities through these questionnaires, right? Gauge what is their understanding and help them understand whatever the new regulations are kicking in before actually, coming up with the compliance part. Diana, let me turn to you. Talking about MSMEs, I think, and I've been pressing on this point again and again, they're still going to be financed, especially the MSMEs are still going to be financed through the banking channels in this region, right, today and in the foreseeable future. And if you see in emerging markets globally, close to just 5% of their lending books is currently low carbon, right? Whereas they hold close to 80% of the financial assets, right? So they play a very important role. Where do you see the problems that domestic banks in the region have in providing for climate finance, not just for MSMEs, but generally, low carbon initiatives? And what role do you think sustainable finance markets can play? Is there a role that issuances of sustainable finance in global markets that can play in providing long-term capital, for instance, for banks to then, on lend for low carbon initiatives and activities?
Yeah, there's quite a few questions actually. Normally we need another session just to address all of this. But let me try. I think we talk about, let's say, if you talk about MSMEs, I will caveat that ING is a wholesale bank. But the reality is, yes, a lot of the SMEs sit within the supply chains of the larger corporates. So what we do see is, in terms of, let's say, financial innovation, you do have sustainability-linked loans or supply chain financings, where we could be incentivizing multinationals or large corporates to step up, perhaps not just their ESG assessments of their supply chain, but they start setting targets to say, if you're starting from scratch this year, you might say, I need to get a gauge of what my scope 3 looks like. Do you know, what your biggest contributors are, where the touch points are? How do you get that down? So some of the companies might actually say, look, I might start getting my suppliers to take up ESG ratings assessments. It could be anything from, it depends on which sectors we're talking about. It could be things like EcoVadis, etc. So once the suppliers start getting on some of this, there is a standardized approach to better understanding where the suppliers are. And how do you then, from a materiality perspective, set targets to encourage your suppliers to take practical steps to decarbonize. So that's maybe one element. For some of the other elements, I think one of the challenges that banks might have sometimes is the banks themselves might have limits in terms of how much lending can be done for specific projects. So one feedback I do get about renewables could be single borrowing limits that constrain lending. If we talk about, we didn't really cover the policy development point, but if you think about sustainable finance and the role that it takes in catalyzing action, some governments, such as in the Philippines, they have actually introduced new legislation for issuers of sustainable bonds in the market. The reserve requirement is being progressively reduced from 3% to 0% over a period of time. That's one development which is actually encouraging because it is a practical step, impacts the reserve requirement for the issue of the bond. The second one that they have actually done, which we'll see as quite interesting, is if the underlying transaction is a sustainable finance transaction, you actually have an increase in the single borrowing limit by 15%. So this is a practical step in terms of where sustainable finance actually enhances liquidity in situations where maybe there are certain constraints. But what about other situations where there are alternative pools of capital? So you might hear from the market, oh, renewables, everybody wants to invest if you have got a decent rate of return. But do people necessarily have the capacity to be doing due diligence on dozens and dozens of projects? And that's where I think from a financial institution perspective, the banks also do have roles to play as intermediaries, where we may be involved in structuring securitizations, for example, where investors get to tap into and allocate capital to perhaps different levels of renewable assets, sustainable assets, in situations where they might not have been a direct lender, but we are trying to crowd in capital rather than crowd out. So we see that these are positive developments. And I think one question that we do get quite commonly is, I think there was also a question in the Q&A, which we're happy to sort of address later. Is there any sort of green premium, or is there any sort of incentive for issuers? So we have observed in the past where there is some incentive in certain cases where there are green premiums available. And we think some of this, depending on which sectors, which countries we're talking about, and the asset class, with more and more disclosure, there is going to be a delineation between what assets are green and which assets are not. It's not going to be executed here yet, but in Europe, you have the green asset ratio. You have a lot of increasing sort of mandatory disclosures in the region. So with that progressing over time, we feel that once more data is available, you might then see a bit more of an influence. But I can quote one of the price premiums in the Q&A later, perhaps.
Thanks, Diana. I think really important points on how the sort of domestic banks can also ratchet up their efforts for financing energy transition in the region. And while there is the predominance of the banking system in the region, we also need functional capital markets, right? Both debt and equity. And we know not just in the region, any emerging market globally does not have really deep and liquid bond markets, right? And if you're talking about financing long-dated infrastructure assets, such as renewable energy, you need those kind of sources of avenues of capital also available. So CX, let me turn to you and let me ask you, what do you think can be done by policymakers and regulators in the region to at least grow the market for sort of green capital markets, right, where domestic issuances by domestic entities happen in the region itself? And maybe you can touch upon the role regulations can also play in this.
I think in a couple of emerging Asian countries, regulators have already sort of introduced various policy guidances or regulatory guidelines in terms of developing sustainable finance instruments. Take Malaysia, for example. I think it's been a couple of years ago, the Securities Commission Malaysia, for instance, have introduced the SRI Link Sukuk framework, which is essentially sustainability-linked bond guidances, but from an Islamic Sharia-compliant instrument perspective. So that's an example of introducing and building up the awareness of sustainability-linked or transition finance instruments for local players. Regionally, there's also the ASEAN Sustainability-Linked Bond Standards, SLB standards. So there has been initiatives in some of the local and regional regulators in sort of building up the momentum and filling up the gaps in terms of guiding local issuers to tap on innovative instruments. So that's also an aspect that, from a climate bonds perspective, we have been supporting some of the local regulators in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, even South Asia as well, to develop more innovative instruments that allow the issuers, corporates, even sovereigns to tap to finance either their clean energy initiatives or the other sustainability projects that they are keen to develop. So one of it is the expansion of the climate bond standard to include guidances for sustainability-linked debt instruments, which is being utilized to also, so climate bonds can now certify sustainability-linked bonds or loans instruments, which are aligned, again, with the standards and sector criteria prescribed. Another aspect would be the expansion of the climate bonds taxonomy with resilience criteria. So last week, CBI launched it in Singapore, did a Singapore launch for the resilience taxonomy, and the official launch for the Asia Pacific will be held in 2 weeks' time in Mumbai during the Climate Bonds Connect, in which Sean Kidney will be there. So happy to extend the invitation for those who are keen to attend the CBI conference. The other aspects that probably it can be utilized, and CBI is already doing it in the region, would be to leverage and work with the multilateral development banks and also state-owned development banks. So in terms of multilateral development banks, as part of the initiative to build and deepen the capital market in emerging Asia, economies like Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, and so on and so forth, which currently do not have a very strong capital market, a robust debt capital market. So one of the aspects is that CBI has been supporting some of the multilateral banks, Asia Development Bank, IFC, and so on, to build the capacity, and also in terms of when building or developing the local capital market, we also introduced the green and sustainable component, which led to the first, in fact, 2 or 3 green bonds has been since issued in Cambodia. So from a state-owned bank, a development bank perspective, CBI has also just embarked with a few ASEAN member countries, alongside some of the donors, to link back to the earlier point in terms of SMEs. So one of the projects that's ongoing is that to work with state-owned agricultural banks to potentially raise sustainable finance, either from a green or even transition needs, which would then channel the capital to agri smallholder farmers as well as agri SMEs. And another aspect, probably an example that I can relay on is CBI has been working with NABFID, National Bank for Financing and Development in India, again collaborating with 10 municipalities to build the capacity, as well as providing technical support and guidance for the municipalities, cities, local officials, in terms of mobilizing capital market, green capital market to finance some of the infrastructure projects.
Thanks, EX. And I think we're running a bit behind schedule, so I'll just quickly ask the last 2 questions for this round, and then we'll jump into the Q&A with the audience. So, Mr. Pimple, this question is for you. We've talked about the lack of capacities for all stakeholders. I think, like I mentioned, it's particularly important for municipalities, right? And it's not just the lack of capacity. There are several challenges that municipalities face when you go out and raise capital or want to pursue, energy transition-related initiatives. So, what exactly are these challenges that are being faced? And can you share some initiatives through which Mumbai municipalities has been able to overcome these challenges? Either political, awareness-related, capacity-related, institution structure-related, or otherwise.
Thank you for the question. As I said earlier, most of our projects, the climate-related, which is adaptation, resilient, and everything, is done by our own financing. At the same time, the bigger projects like SWM processing plant and something like that, that we have successfully operated on PPP model. There is one more rules in India that CSR fund has to be it, corporate social responsibility, and that is a lot of funds are available through that media now. There are certain criterias that you have to be above certain level. This much of profit, more than that, 2% of net profit has to be in CSR, and which area you have to invest, there is a rules and regulations for that. So that is one of the big chunk that money is coming from. And literally now it's happening in India, especially in Mumbai, that companies are running after to take this money, show us some good projects. Like that, we are also started using CSR funds. Of course, there are certain complications also. We are trying to overcome that complications. The main issue what I found is in Mumbai, or for that matter in India, when we look at the thing from the environment and climate change perspective, most of us, barring few experts or academia, the words, two words like global warming and climate change, they don't know the difference between that. They don't know what action they should do, how their small act is going to save the climate, save the global warming. So what I feel that is the biggest challenge to go for awareness programs. BCC activity has to be there. We has to go for instead of using private cars, we should go for public transport. Now in Mumbai, earlier we had only one metro. If you know the geography of Mumbai is north-south, north-south. And both sides of the Arabian Sea. So now within next 1 or 1.5 years time, 11 new metro lines will be coming up. So now worldwide there is experience, correct me if I'm wrong, that moment there is a metro, it is expected that the vehicular movement should go down. But that is not the case in the most of the time. So again, this is a part of awareness. If how I'm going to save my time, save the fuel, save the environment, save your air pollution. So this is the biggest challenge, I believe, to change the mindset of the people about the action, day-to-day action they take, they should be environment friendly. So when we have started working on this, then what we have realized that we ourselves, ULB does a lot of things through our various departments because all ULB has to go for look for the transport, water, sanitation, everything, and other things too. So it was very important for us that our own staff should have a green lens. So we have started the capacity building programs. We have started organizing sessions department-wise so that the person who is working for the Mumbai people knows what he's doing, what changes he should do, a minor alteration, but that is going to get good result. So I think this is the biggest challenge. If you can succeed that, a small example I can tell you that when we assessed our own electrical consumptions, then we realized that in a particular room there are unnecessary 5 lights. 6 lights. You can work with a few lights. So minimum use of electricity. So it is made mandatory for all department to reduce their energy consumption by 10%. Now, if you see, when I said about the awareness among the common people, one small thing I would like to emphasize that now what we are getting over a period of time, we are getting good water, good roads, good lights, everything. But now people are forgetting the difference between need and want. If you can figure out the things between need and want, I think you can succeed a lot. Because by doing all mitigations, measure, adaptation, resilience, although they are important, but if you reduce your want, I think you can get a major success in that. So that should be the first aim, and that is our priority. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pimple. I think very moralistic advice over there. Reduce your wants if you really want the planet to succeed or sustain in the future. Dennis, lastly, I'll turn to you. And as we end the Q&A with the panel, if you could share your views about the next frontier in terms of the regulatory developments on the ESG space. And we're seeing that a lot of transition planning sort of regulations are kicking in globally, and there are conversations with capital market regulators, even banking sector regulators in this region also. Should we jump on that bandwagon? Should we also sort of roll out these regulations for our regulated entities? But again, the level of ESG maturity in developed markets where we've seen that kind of an action is very different from what it's happening over here. So what do you think should be the best approach to go forward with any kind of new regulations in this particular space? And should we even consider coming up with new regulations in the first place or not? So over to you.
Thank you. So on the subject of transition planning, and again, what's it got to do with sustainable finance? So transition planning is the most popular buzzword that I've heard over the past year now, and it underpins the collection of data which shows that you are advanced enough to access sustainable finance, really. That's what the linkage is. Interestingly, we had a report out a few months ago that was called The State of Play of Transition Planning Globally, based upon an analysis of CDP data collection from 2023. 6,000 companies of the 20-odd thousand companies that disclosed to CDP said that they had a transition plan. That was a 44% increase on the last year of 4,000 companies that had said that they had a transition plan. So that was a massive leap ahead in the quality of data that could underpin sustainable finance. Because we have this large set of data, we were able to see the elements of what indicates whether you have a transition plan or not. And there were 21 criteria that we identified in about 8 different buckets, which we said, you know what, if you tick the box in these 8 areas, in these 21 areas, the points of data, then we're going to say that's a indicator of a good transition plan. If you've only got 3 of these indicators, then poorly aligned. If you've got 10, if you've got 18, if you've got 21. 21 was where we put credible transition plan. So to recap there, 6,000 companies said that they had a transition plan, but how many of them actually ticked all 21 boxes? Actually, it boiled down to 100 odd. It turned out to be 0.6% of the 20,000 companies that disclosed that actually had a credible transition plan. Now, you are saying that regulators around the world are all homing in on saying that put a transition plan and starting to regulate it, or offer frameworks on it. It's built into the IFRS, it's built into EFRAG, it's built into the Transition Planning Task Force of the UK, it's built into GFANS. So everybody's showing interest in saying what a credible transition plan. When we map what CDP's 21 indicators versus all of those frameworks, there's a great deal of alignment. Each and every one of those might diverge on one thing or 2 things alone. This particular framework might not emphasize net zero. The other frameworks, including CDP, say you got to have a net zero target before you can really claim you have a transition plan. But if you want best practice, and what's best practice for Asia, and our advice for regulators as to what you should do, I'll sum this up. Don't do what the United States has done. The SEC's version of this omits ensuring that supply chain and scope 3 is included. It omits saying that you should feed back what you find in your environmental planning into your financial planning. The most interesting thing it omits is linking what a company's environmental performance is like to the compensation of the chief executive and their management. That right there makes everyone pay attention when you make your management's pay related to what the company does from an environmental sense. So don't do what the US does, read the report, see those kind of indicators. Those are the recommendations of best practice.
Thanks, Dennis. I think that's how you align interests and incentives when it comes to sustainability. So I'll just take a couple of questions from the audience. I think there are a lot of them, but most of them we can take them offline. But there's one which has got most number of votes, which says ASEAN and some individual countries' taxonomies offer amber or transition categories. How global financial institutions view those categorizations? Do they meet more global green standards? I think we can just focus on the first part of the question. I think it's 3 questions bundled into one. So how global financial institutions view such amber, sort of a traffic light kind of a taxonomy system? CX, do you want to take that up?
So in terms of the traffic light system, so that's an approach that CBI worked with two regulators in the region, Singapore as well as Thailand, so Bank of Thailand and also Monetary Authority of Singapore, in introducing a transition component to the taxonomy, which was previously focusing on more of classification of green economic activities. So that's also an approach that the regulators are trying to assist and guide the hard-to-abate sectors in terms of eventually moving to greener pastures, or in the sense of energy, eventually transition to cleaner and renewable energy. So that's an sort of ongoing initiatives, either from client bonds or various regulators that have been sort of listening, again, to the industry feedback and working on policy guidances in the sense of, in such case, a taxonomy or sector criteria that provides guidances to industry, especially the financial industry and real sector economy, to move their, sort of mobilize their investments to cleaner pastures. Yep.
I'll just take one more question in the interest of time. So there's this question which says, for companies that dabble both in fossil fuels and renewable energy, how do banks ensure that their financing is ring-fenced and doesn't go to fossil fuels? Diana, I think this is for you.
Yeah, maybe I'll cover this point. I think we do look at ring fencing quite seriously. So you do have controls, let's say, within facility agreements to state exactly what the funds are supposed to be used for. Besides your regulatory sort of reporting, I think it's also important to cover other elements, meaning that banks typically do have environmental and social risk frameworks. So what are in these frameworks? It doesn't just cover use of proceeds. Use of proceeds is one element. You would have other controls around the due diligence requirements that are required for projects. It could cover the environmental pieces. It could cover impact assessments on a social perspective. Do companies set up, do they have grievance mechanisms available to the communities where they operate in, depending on the types of financings? There are other sort of standards that many banks do adhere to. For example, we are actually a signatory of Equator Principles. So many banks in the market are signatories as well. So for any sort of project-based financing, or one interesting point is that people think it's just for project financing, but it's not. It actually does cover some corporate level financings where the use of proceeds are for specific sort of projects, if you got more than X number of lenders. So there is actually a certain sort of element that covers corporate deals, but it is still subject to the requirements under Equator Principles. And for certain projects, we then also look at the IFC standards in terms of environmental standards. So those are some of the ways that we would sort of be looking at the ESR risk assessments.
Thank you so much, Jan. And I think with that, we'll bring the session to a close. It's been really interesting and insightful for me personally, listening to all of you, and I hope it's been the same for the audience. Thank you so much for taking out the time and coming over here for the conference. And I look forward to engaging with you post this session. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shantanu and panelists, for that fantastic session on the role of sustainable finance for energy transition, emerging Asian markets. May I ask and request for you all to rise and take one step forward for a quick group photograph before you leave the stage. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, meanwhile, it's time for a short break. Let's get those legs stretched, and there's coffee and light refreshments being served outside, coffee, tea, etc., right at the Lake Garden foyer. A quick note as well, that later on, once the proceedings are done for today, please do return your lanyards for recycling and helping us, of course, keep Energy Finance 2024 as green as possible. You may return your lanyards to the desk, which is right opposite the registration counter where you entered. Thank you so much, and we look forward to welcoming you back here by about 3:45, 3:45 p.m., back here in Ballroom A and B for the final session of Energy Finance 2024. See you then, ladies and gentlemen.